Hello, everybody. Welcome back to That CMMC Show. Today, we have a very, very special show with a very dear friend of mine who I've known. Larry, what are we talking, like 20 years? Something
Probably.
like that?
Yeah.
Known Larry Grate for a long time. And he is Larry the Great when we're talking about the specific things that we're talking about today, which is operational technology, manufacturing, and cybersecurity kind of pending regulations with CMMC and what the impact is, but then just good cyber practices. I know, Larry, you've been in the space for a very, very long time. You've seen some crazy things that we'll talk about later in the episode, but tell us a little bit about your background and kind of who you are and how you ended up where you are.
Yeah, so my name is Larry Grate, as has already been said, Director of Business Development for OT Infrastructure and Security for a company called EOSYS. We're based out of Nashville, Tennessee, do work basically all over the United States. I've been in the system integration space on the manufacturing side of things for 35 years. Everything from making cars to candy bars to pulp and paper, steel, specialty chemical, kind of you name it. The last 15 years, thinking about how do we actually secure these assets? What should critical infrastructure look like? Did leave EOSYS for 2 years, had an opportunity to do some federal work for a couple of years, doing assessments at DoD installations and sites. About 6 months back at EOSYS, essentially trying to help build out our business in this space. So yeah, and it's great to see you again. And like you said, we've known each other for at least since 2007 timeframe anyway.
Yep.
Long time.
Long time, Larry. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but here we are, right?
For you, it might be bad news. I don't know.
Well, with that being said, one of the things I tell people all the time, because my background before I turned to the dark side of sales and engagement was IT, right? Just similar to you, right? You were hands-on doing the work, which when you do the work on the kind of, at least on the IT side of the house, which is what I was doing, and then you transition to cyber, your core understanding is so much deeper, right? Because cyber is great and you can understand risk, but if you know how the system is supposed to function, you're better prepared on the cyber side. Same thing on the manufacturing side, I'm assuming, right?
No, absolutely true, right? I mean, it definitely helps to have a good understanding of how these systems were intended to operate so that when something doesn't work the way you expect it to, you can more quickly get to root cause, whether that root cause is something not malicious or whether it is some kind of a threat actor essentially in the environment or an insider doing something that you don't want them to be doing.
Yeah, and that's kind of where having that background, as we'll kind of talk about through it, is really important, especially even as it comes to CMMC, right? Because CMMC is a little interesting with what they refer to as specialized assets. So specialized assets is kind of that OT, ICS, IoT type systems. And CMMC at a level 2 basically gave people a break and said, listen, we're not going to make you do 110 controls. We're just going to have you have your own security policies and procedures, and we're going to review them, make sure you have them, but we're not going to levy the power of all NIST 800-171 against you, right? At least at a level 2. Now, level 3, which is going to impact probably less than 1% of the supply chain, they do levy those controls over those systems as well. And so that's going to be for a very small portion of our audience and the overall supply chain. But just because regulation doesn't really say you have to implement all of these controls, at least on the CMMC side, you are going to have proof that you've done something, right? You don't have to do NIST 800-171, which is good because that wasn't written for OT spaces, right? It was written for more corporate IT environments. And so one of the things that we've kind of talked about before, Larry, is, well, what actually is a good framework, some good systems, tools, resources to build some of these policies and procedures to protect the security of an OT manufacturing space?
Yeah, so full disclosure, I'm a member of the IEC 62443 committee, so I'm probably a little bit biased, but I think that framework is really, or standard is really the best one if you're going to gravitate to something to really build a security program in your industrial control systems or the OT side of your house. There's a lot of good guidance there. There's a lot of good direction that's available. -3-2 specifically addresses risk assessment, which becomes the foundation of how you do the rest of what you do in ICS OT. We really, unfortunately, for too many years have not been doing what needs to happen And so as a result, we're way behind the curve, and it's really not practical to try to address all of the risks immediately. You need a plan. You need to decide what's the most important and go after those first. And then as you kind of chip off the big items, you can start working your way down that list. And so that risk assessment process that's a part of 62443, or whether you use some other framework out of the CSF guidance or something like that, for an initial risk assessment, that's a great first step, and it helps you prioritize kind of where do I go from here as I move down the software stack. So that would be my first. Second would be the 882 overlays. Those are also very good. All the NIST documentation is helpful. And it's again about, to your point, of understanding ICS operational technology. What can and can't I do in this space? What makes sense to apply in this space? I feel for those at a level 3 that have to try to go do all 121 controls of 800, 171, because frankly, most of ICS just isn't ready for it. And so you're going to be doing a lot of compensating controls there because you can't address some things specifically based on hardware limitations.
And it feels like most organizations are having this whiplash effect, right? So it's like they went from doing nothing to now having to do at least something for CMMC level 2, and then level 3 being 134 things that they're going to have to implement potentially or have compensating controls for. And so when people are trying to ease into this, like, I mean, is this like a full-time job for somebody? Is this something that, people outsource? How do you even find people that are, would you say, competent in this field? Because I know that's a big problem, at least on the IT corporate cyber side. There's not a lot of bodies that seem to know this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you definitely have that problem multiplied essentially in operational technology for a number of reasons, right? So for years, we basically ignored the problem, ignored it as it continued to become a bigger issue. And as a result, we continued to deploy things that were essentially not secure by design. We didn't really think about how we were actually going to implement appropriate security controls on these systems as they were deployed. And so, in many instances, essentially, they were deployed without any real thought or process in terms of how you were going to secure those environments. And you really kind of have two things going on in industry almost simultaneously, too. You've got the CMMC requirements coming out that directly affect the DIB. Yep. Interestingly enough, what I really hadn't considered was the flow down of that into even some manufacturers that we work with, for example, more on the commercial side, that I would not have considered to be a defense contractor, but because some of their products find their way into the supply chain of the defense industrial base, they're actually having to implement things out of CMMC that I would not have expected to get phone calls about, to be frank. The other thing that you have happening in parallel to that is basically ransomware as a service taking off, and people realizing on the ransomware side that, hey, I'm a lot more likely to pay the ransom if my manufacturing environment is down than I am if my IT environment is down. So on the commercial side of things, not necessarily defense industrial base related, you've got that going on at the same time, which is putting more of a strain on the already limited resources that can help people really understand, what are these systems? What can and can't I do with these systems? OT and IT are very different, and you can't approach securing them in the same way. You'll use a lot of the same controls, but you're going to implement them differently because of the nature of the OT environment.
And I think that's where a lot of people see a disconnect, right? They think IT can just solve the OT problem as well on the cyber side. Oh, you get ransomware there. It's the same remediation process if you get ransomware on IT systems, right? And it's like, even though they both might run Windows, for example, the dealing with that to keep production alive is very, very different, right? Like, go ahead.
Yeah, and you and I were getting a little bit ahead, maybe into talking war stories in addition, right? But we kind of shared the conversation we had about a level 2, tier 2. Supplier in automotive, for example, that actually had ransomware in their OT environment. And unlike the IT, we can't just immediately quarantine, take those assets offline. They chose to leave it there and operate that way for almost 6 months until they got to an appropriate turnaround. They put additional controls in place to be sure that a internet connection could never happen to allow the actual ransomware to start encrypting assets. But they operate very differently because of that than we would in the IT space. Things that you can do tend to be different, and you got to kind of think through what that really means and what an appropriate incident response plan is for operational technology, which again is going to look very different from what it looks like in IT.
Well, I remember this story talking about war stories. This was probably 2 or 3 years ago, where Toyota had to suspend production of a vehicle because somebody, let's call it 10 deep in their supply chain, had a ransomware event where they couldn't make a specific part of a door or a seat or something like that, which basically ripple effect all the way back up to Toyota's production line. And so when we're talking about some of these war stories, what are some other things that you've heard, maybe more specifically kind of critical infrastructure or even kind of DIB related, that you've seen people have to deal with, like targeted attacks, insider threat? Like what kind of things have you seen from like a war story perspective?
Yeah, so you already mentioned kind of the tier two automotive supplier. It was not in this specific instance wasn't in the Toyota supply chain, and obviously didn't result in any kind of an outage for the person that was downstream for them. But there certainly have been multiple instances where somebody deep in the supply chain essentially interrupts the entire ability to manufacture, whatever that end product might be, whether it's an automobile, whether it's electronic components, different things of that nature. One of the reasons that Don Capelli, for example, even left Rockwell and went to Dragos and helped form OT Cert was looking at Rockwell's supply chain and realizing the fragility of a lot of the small vendors, essentially small manufacturers that provided things for them. As an example, they ran into issues with some of the plastic covers on some of the equipment. So imagine here you are, a major industrial control system manufacturer can't ship product because you can't put a cover on the product appropriately. Right? So there's a lot of examples out there of different things like that have happened essentially that impact supply chain in ways that you really don't think about. We got a real good view of that with COVID, right? I mean, that wasn't all cyber related, but there were a lot of supply chain issues that came up in that helped us to realize some of the risks that were out there that weren't really being addressed from a supply chain risk management perspective. Completely different from OT security necessarily, right? But could feed in. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, if you can't get the stuff that you need, we got a problem. Supply chain risk all day. And the DoD is not a fan of taking on a lot of supply chain risk, right? And that's one of the interesting things about CMMC is people are like, oh my gosh, CMMC is going to kill the supply chain, right? Too much regulation, cybersecurity, and the DoD is like, listen, we're okay with a smaller, tighter supply chain if we know the data is protected, because our risk is mitigated greatly by, Iran and Russia and North Korea not targeting environments and companies that aren't protected to actually have this data or produce, or manufacture the things that we need them to make. And so that's kind of one of the interesting takes when you kind of go through it is like, CMMC, yes, it's going to be what I call a great consolidator. The supply chain is going to look very different in the next 3 years. But part of that's actually going to be good because of the risk should be able to drop, not a lot, but at least make pretty good strides towards dropping cyber risk of these different types of environments right now. Again, CMMC level 2 was a little soft on OT manufacturing specifically, but I have a feeling come with later versions that will probably get more serious, especially as the actual manufacturing technology itself is actually able to keep up with the pace of having cyber options, right? Because we've talked about that a lot, Larry. I mean, you go into some of these environments that they have equipment that's decades old, right? That's critical to the production process. I mean, you can't just go in there and slap on an EDR tool or a firewall and, make sure things are protected, right? Like, how do people go in and even mitigate some of those risks today?
Yeah, so it really depends a lot on the platform of what you're trying to secure, and kind of back to that risk assessment and understanding where your vulnerabilities lie. If I could back up maybe a half step, you mentioned, all the controls essentially around protecting data. Yep. Well, in operational technology, that data is used essentially to manipulate the physical world around you. And so the risks associated with operational technology really extend beyond the loss of the information. But, actually the inability, for example, as we've talked about from a supply chain perspective, to make a product, or in the right cases, right? If you go back to look at the Triton Trisus attack, for an example, the end result could have been an explosion at the facility and loss of life. And so when you start thinking about ICS and OT security, it's not just about protecting data, but it's about protecting human life, protecting supply chain, protecting your ability to make money and to manufacture components. In terms of you also bring up the point of so much of it being old, right? I mean, we deploy things even today, unfortunately, that still weren't necessarily designed with security in mind. So I would argue that on the ICS side of the house, probably 80% of the controllers deployed today still don't support encryption and authentication. In the ICS space, not talking about building automation, because that's a little different. They've gotten a little further ahead of the pipe than industrial controls have. So to your question about how do I go about securing these things? Well, it becomes a lot of defensible architecture, right? Appropriately segmenting these different systems and then providing firewalls essentially at the perimeter and kind of creating that hardened perimeter. I know everybody's all excited about zero trust today, and
I love zero trust. The buzzword of all buzzwords, Larry.
If you want to get money approved today, just stamp zero trust on the product, and all of a sudden zero trust or AI, and all of a sudden there's
there you go. Well, we talked about zero trust. If you put it on the wrong systems, that architecture or even tools that say they're zero trust could amount to no trust in your actual manufacturing environment, right? And that's the dance, I guess you could say, of implementing some of these controls.
Yeah, as you start talking about zero trust implementations and what that really means, it's ultimately really microsegmentation when the end device itself can't support any kind of authentication. So you're putting a device in front of a device. Well, the minute I do that, right, I've essentially, there's no way to have improved the reliability of the system at that point. I'm adding components. By default, I'm going to be reducing the overall reliability of that system. And depending on how that component manages failover and things of that nature, in the IT world, we can live with a 3-second outage. Nobody cares. In my world, 3 seconds and you're down. Right? There's no, you're back in a startup process to bring a manufacturing process back up from the dead, essentially. And so as you look at how you deploy zero trust, it's really more about creating appropriate zones and applying zero trust controls to the zone. And while they don't like the word, the reality is you still need to trust some of the assets inside that zone, because by their nature and their the way that they function, there really isn't good ways to not affect potentially availability or not affect resilience and actually implement zero trust solutions down at those levels. In fact, I'm actually doing a presentation for DAU during the Zero Trust Conference on some of the challenges essentially of implementing zero trust in ICS OT environments for that very reason.
Well, and that brings an interesting thing, because going back to your risk assessment piece of it, right? Like, one of the questions that we came up with is, what are some of the largest security risks to OT ICS spaces, and how do you actually go through remediating? Because a lot of people want to buy a tool or a product or slap a box, like you said, in front of their environment and say, thank God I'm covered. This magical little zero trust box is going to do everything I need it to do to protect my environment. I can now step away. But again, going back to risk, unless you know what risk that you're maybe particularly being targeted for, you don't even know what tools or policies or anything to implement to actually mitigate those things. So in your experience, what are some of the top risk that you see facing the OT ICS space?
Yeah, so if we just look at most of our customer base, and you start having a conversation about, what keeps you up at night, what are you worried about? The two big ones that come up every time that we have conversations are remote access exploitation, right? So I need remote access at this point to be able to run my process. I don't have the right SMEs in every manufacturing facility. I've got to be able to get that SME access to the system to help me troubleshoot, get something back up and running. So that remote access exploitation is always a risk that's there, a threat that's there. And then the other one is ransomware today, which is just such a huge issue. If you look at ransomware in manufacturing, it's actually targeted more than IT at this point. And so you're really having a hard time dealing with that. The other things that we see people very concerned about are, insider threats, whether that insider is an employee or a supply chain, right? So it could be somebody like myself that's a system integrator coming into work in a manufacturing environment or a manufacturing space, or it could be an actual employee. And then these last couple kind of get into, supply chain is the other concern, right? So you look at what happens and how you think about supply chain on the IT side of the house frequently, but on the OT side of the house, back to that story of, hey, we're running assets that are 20, 30 years old. How do I actually get the components that I need to repair those? Well, you'd be shocked at the number of even defense customers that are actually buying parts off eBay to keep something up and running. How do you manage supply chain risk when you're buying third party, God knows where it came from, right?
It's funny because I know a company that I had talked to was buying SCSI drives off of eBay for their MS-DOS Windows 3.1 critical system. And they're like, they don't know what's on those drives, to your point, right? Like, where are they sourcing this stuff from? Well, you can't get it from anywhere else but eBay, right? Or other kind of like auction third-party sites. I didn't even think about that, but that's a huge risk.
Yeah, it's a huge risk, and it's a major problem. There are companies out there, won't name them, essentially, that specialize in basically buying up assets that are being taken out of service and putting them on the shelf and then making them available to those that basically need them to keep something up and running. If you're looking at like a legacy PLC or a legacy DCS system or things of that nature, you mentioned SCSI drives, right? I have a customer still running MFM drives on their historian. So just imagine, you can't buy that anymore, right? You're buying that used. And how long does it last? I mean, you might get 6 months out of it. You might get a year out of it, and then you're doing it again. So you got to start thinking about, how do I get away from a lot of these legacy assets? And then, the next piece of it is, what do you do about that, right? So if you think about, if your biggest concern is ransomware, then an OT specific incident response plan, and I'm really, some of this falls back on what SANS has promoted as being their top 5 security controls. Their number one essentially is an ICS-OT specific incident response plan. My experience has been that the first part of that ends up becoming, which is kind of funny because it ties into CMMC level 2 so well, is having a good disaster recovery plan. Because the reality is a lot of these guys don't have good backups of all their configurable assets that are out there on the floor. And so the first thing you got to do is figure out where are all these configuration files at. Well, to know that, I've got to know what assets are out there that are configurable, right? So I have to have that inventory of the different components that are out there that are configurable, programmable in some way, shape, or form, and then make sure you've got backups of those. And then the other piece that on an incident response plan, I'll just kind of shameless plug, it's easy on the IT side of the house to make an image of something and know that I have the entire configuration. I can put it back and I can start up and run. In OT, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you got 2 different use cases essentially become a problem. One is the state of the data that's in the asset might be such that you can't just start it back up. You got to get it to a known state and be able to do that. And that can be a challenge. The other is really calibration, right? So people don't think about the fact that a lot of these assets require some type of a calibration process in order to be able to get data out of them that's trustworthy and reliable. So my disaster recovery plan isn't just put the configuration back, but then call the person that I need to be able to do the calibration on that equipment and get it back up and running. Better to be not in an emergency situation trying to work through what are these processes and how do I actually build out this plan than be in the middle of a firefight and then realize, I got this device back up. Well, I still can't use it because I need the company that need to come out here and actually do the calibration on the equipment.
Because it's so much easier on the IT side, right? Like the 2 CMMC controls, one is protect the confidentiality of your backup, again, assuming you have a backup, but the other one is baseline security configurations, right? Which, hey, I can just spin up another Windows computer, join it, it's going to get an Intune or a group policy, and we're good. But you're saying, this could be a days or weeks or months things to get someone to come recalibrate the system. It's not just an easy policy you push.
Right. No, absolutely. You're not putting, and the other thing is, I don't know of any PLC that accepts a group policy push, right? So you have even the hardening and the different things that you're going to be doing in those environments. That's all very specific to the hardware, essentially, that you're actually using to do to run this equipment. We do use a lot of Windows, right? So the reality is that there are some places where, the typical recovery tools you'd use for re-imaging an HMI that might be a Windows 10 box or something like that may work well. But to your point earlier about, EDR solutions, I don't know too many EDR solutions that work in Windows 7 or XP anymore. And I still have customers running MS-DOS. So, it's a different world when you start looking at even the visualization and user interfaces associated with industrial automation and OT systems. How else what are the other controls that a lot of times are implemented in operational technology? Defensible network architecture. So whether that's, macro segmentation, micro segmentation. Typically, you're going to start at the macro level. Majority of the switches that you'll find deep in the infrastructure of industrial control systems today are still largely unmanaged. So we're not even typically talking about managed infrastructure. And so first thing you got to do if you want to implement any kind of macro or micro segmentation is replace those with things that are managed, and then appropriately configure them and start doing the segmentation. And that segmentation is not as simple as changing an IP address, because oftentimes those assets have configuration in them looking for the IPs of the other devices on the network, and they're statically assigned. It's not dynamic. It's not done by name. And so you're literally having to go into those configurations and modify them, which takes time. So now you got to schedule an outage, right? Because we're not doing this stuff on the run. We can't do it in parallel. We're typically doing it. One of the things that I like to say about OT is it's IT with physics, right? All this stuff.
Everything's moving.
Everything's moving. Everything's wired to something. You can't just replace an asset. And in the IT world, you unplug the network connector, you unplug the power connector. Maybe if you're going to keep the monitor, you unplug the video adapter, and you're back up and running with a new asset.
Yep.
And in OT, I may have hundreds or thousands of wires that are terminated on this equipment. And so replacing that IO structure becomes some of the most expensive things, essentially, that become a part of any kind of upgrade or migration to newer technology. So defensible network architecture, ICS network visibility. So, the typical network IDS solutions that you're going to run in the IT space, you could use those in OT. The challenge typically is the protocols we run are very different from what you run in IT. The positive in OT is that most of them are positive and negative. Most of them are unencrypted. And so I can get a lot more rich information out of those OT protocols. So back to baselining things and understanding what normal looks like on a network. In OT, we tend to be very static. We're not seeing a lot of variability in who's talking to whom and what are the typical commands that are being thrown across the wire. And so we can learn what normal looks like much more easily in OT and alert on things that are abnormal. And so that network visibility becomes a huge piece of a security control to implement in OT.
And when you're talking network, are you talking one network logically separated between corporate IT and the OT manufacturing space? Or are you seeing most people just do completely two different networks, right? A corp network and a manufacturing. Are small businesses more likely to have a flat network? And then as you grow in size and complexity, maybe you do, better physical segmentation, or do you still stick primarily with logical? What do you see in that world?
Yeah. So, I would love that. It's funny to me because a lot of people are like, oh, we're air gapped. I can't tell you how many times I walk into a manufacturing facility and they tell me, oh, we're air gapped. Our OT environment is completely separated from our IT environment. There's no connectivity whatsoever, no connectivity to the outside world. And then you start doing a network assessment and you find either that connectivity does exist and IT doesn't realize it, right? Which is not uncommon. And it's, you would think that IT would have to be involved, but in many instances, apparently they're not.
You can put a cellular modem on just about anything these days. So
next thing, right? So you start finding cellular devices. We were doing an assessment at a facility that up in the mid Northwest, and it was really just a gap assessment. And we started off, and they're like, "Yeah, here's all our vendors, and blah blah blah. Everybody comes in through our secure VPN, yada yada yada." And I looked down the list, and I happened to be there the day before. Kind of back to your point of what we do for a living. We were commissioning some new equipment, and I knew an OEM had been in doing work on that equipment for us, essentially as a part of some migration that we were doing, and they weren't on the access list. And I said, really? That's interesting. They're like, oh, there's no way they were in. I said, let's go take a walk. And we walked out to the piece of equipment, opened the doors on the equipment, and there sits a cellular modem. And so I'm like, yeah, well. And the other thing that a lot of folks don't think about, on the IT side of the house, typically we're still doing some kind of authentication. It may not be a full zero trust implementation between applications or assets or things of that nature. So a VPN into IT, while it can be bad, doesn't just give you open kimono, I have full access to your network. Not true on the OT side of the house, right? So you give a vendor VPN access to their OT network and they have full access to everything. So back to your comments about segmentation, from a best practice perspective, you really want some additional logical segmentation in place in those different zones that affect your network differently, right? And then when you have critical things like safety instrumented systems or man safety systems, things of that nature, they should be an additional segmented zone within the larger zone. so that if I have a compromised asset or I have an adversary in the environment, they don't have full access to everything. They have access to whatever is within that specific zone. And there should be additional controls to keep them from getting to the things that might affect human safety. So that's just some best practices from a segmentation perspective. The other thing is, there's so much right now in this industry 4.0, digital transformation, whatever you want to call it. So everybody's trying to connect these assets in ways that they've never been connected before. I mean, DoD included. There's initiatives that are going on inside the Department of Defense to gain access to a lot of these types of manufacturing and water waste treatment facilities and so on and so forth, to be able to gain efficiencies or use energy better or whatever. And so all of a sudden, these systems and assets that used to be pseudo air gapped, at least, right? Maybe they had a third party that would come in and get to them once in a while to do maintenance on them or upgrades, things of that nature, are all of a sudden connected in ways that they were, never connected before. And I don't necessarily mean unmitigated connections, right? But the minute I have a connection, now I have a threat vector that I have to think about. And that's where monitoring that, having visibility in that network becomes clear, and it becomes key and really critical to being able to make sure that that I do have a secure process to work from.
So you showed me something the other day, talking a little bit more about that. I'm going to share my screen here for just a second, because this report you sent me, Larry, is fascinating.
Oh,
because like people ask us all the time, going back to like the security piece of it, right? Like the advice and the recommendations that you gave is great, and I hope anyone listening is going to start following down that rabbit hole to protect their OT space. But people ask us all the time, Daniel, like, how much is CMMC going to cost me? Or better yet, how much do people budget for CMMC? And you sent me a SANS report that basically says how much people are budgeting for OT cybersecurity, which, by the way, is way less than they're budgeting for CMMC. So like if I pull up this, I mean, it's just a fascinating kind of peek behind the curtain, if you will. Let me pull this here. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. But I mean, small businesses, I mean, we're looking at under $5,000 for 10%, 11%, and most of them in this list, if you look at the small side, 38% don't even know or unsure, meaning it's probably not a lot of money, right? And only until you start getting down to like the large and medium are you seeing real significant upticks in spend in OT cyber, ICS cyber. Whereas a lot of these small and medium, it's basically, non-existent or probably not as much as it should be, right? Are you seeing that kind of be a true reflection of the world as we see it today? Like people aren't spending enough on OT cyber, and it's basically kind of exposing them in ways that they shouldn't be exposed?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a true statement that the majority of our small to medium manufacturers certainly are under budgets, underspend from where they need to be in terms of protecting those assets. But in many cases, like I said, we really, unfortunately, in this community, don't think about security like we should. So we don't realize the risks that are out there and the things that often happen in this space. And so people are just kind of taking their chances and running the way they're running. And there's a lot of resistance too. I mean, you look at people that do OT configuration, support, so on and so forth. I mean, let's face it, at the end of the day, security is never going to be frictionless. There's always going to be some amount of friction as a result of implementing a security control. And you're talking about a community of folks that have been operating for 30 years and really have had zero friction from any kind of security control or implementation. And so as you begin to bring that into the environment, there's a lot of conflict that actually arises. And then you had a lot of folks too on the IT side of the house that would come down with, hey, we're going to do it this way, without really understanding how OT works, and wanting to do things that just weren't practical, or were going to actually inhibit or prevent production from being able to do their job. And so there's a lot of friction that exists there, and a lot of battling between OT and IT departments, essentially, and how you go about securing these infrastructures. And so I was actually on a panel a number of years ago at a Rockwell event. Somebody asked the question, they said, what's the most interesting role you've been in the last year? And I said, referee.
Mediator, right? It's like, come on, guys.
Counselor, take your pick, right? Whatever name you want to put on it. At the end of the day, it's really about being a communication consultant effectively between the OT and the IT side of the house. And it's funny because a lot of times they're talking at each other using the same words and meaning completely different things. And so, sometimes it's literally slowing people down and saying, hey, when he says this, this is what he really means by that. When they say
yep.
they say they can't have their desktops lock because it's an operator station, they're serious about that, right?
Yeah.
And the IT guys are like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you need compensating controls. Is it in a control room that's monitored? Do you really need that computer to go to sleep? Because if that operator needs to perform a function, he needs to be able to perform that function now, and fiddling over a password is a bad idea.
Yep. And that's kind of the interesting piece is like, I've been in environments, large manufacturers where all have legal, IT, some OT pieces of it. And like you said, it's the same vocabulary people are using, but very differing definitions.
Yep.
And it's just like, that's the main problem when you go into these situations and you play referee, you mediate. It's like, you guys have been saying the same thing. One time I was up in Illinois for 5 days at this organization, and the whole time they were talking at each other, saying the exact same things. And then you have to come in and basically be like, that word actually is defined as this word here, and it's defined as this word here, and it's the same, right?
Yep.
Or it's close enough, right? And that's kind of the interesting piece. Like you said, it's like a lot of people agree with each other. They just don't know they agree yet.
Yeah,
which is in the CMMC space. So,
yep. And the last thing I'll mention, kind of back to the security control implementation, is vulnerability management in OT looks very different than it does in IT. You would never in the IT side of the house choose to accept the vulnerability and live with it. But in OT, depending on where an asset lives inside the environment, it may be a greater risk to the organization to patch that asset than it is to continue to run with it, knowing that it's vulnerable. And then you think about what is the vulnerability, right? If I've got a remote code execution vulnerability on a PLC, for example, but that PLC doesn't do any type of authentication or encryption, why would an adversary pop the vulnerability to have his will with a device when he can just send it commands and it'll do whatever he wants it to do?
Yep.
And so you really have to think about a true risk-based vulnerability management process. Now, as you get closer to the edge of OT, that's where you need to be patching more frequently. It's one of the reasons that S4 a number of years ago had a now, next, never kind of thought process that they wanted to bring into vulnerability management, where something close to the edge, known compromised, you need to patch it now because and being close to the edge, it should not have an impact on production, right? That's the other piece. As you're building these things out, you need to be building them out with thought process to how do we actually do vulnerability management with these assets. The next is, when's the next outage? When's the next opportunity to actually do vulnerability management broadly in the manufacturing environment? And the never is literally those assets that you're going to choose to just leave. You're going to put additional compensating controls in place. You're going to do what you can to make sure that they're secure, because an insecure system is an unsafe system.
Yep.
But it's, really making those conscious decisions and then documenting that, knowing so that when something comes up again, we can't get into kind of where or why. But we were doing some work at a DoD installation, prior job, not current life, and found some OT assets essentially directly on Nipper. And it was really an interesting situation. And when we actually deployed some new network security monitoring tools and the vulnerabilities were identified, the CIO there basically was desperately wanting to patch them immediately. And I'm like, you can't. And he's like, what do you mean I can't? I said, well, if you patch that, you're going to break this, this, and this. And he just kind of looked at me like, how do you know that, number one? Are you sure you're right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm 100% sure I'm right. I do this for a living. We build systems like this for a living. If you want to approach this and fix it, we can help you with that. But the right answer is get it off Nipper, because it doesn't belong there.
It doesn't belong. It should never have been put on there. Somebody plugged a cable into a port they should never have plugged it into.
Yep. So,
well, Larry, that kind of wraps up this particular episode, but you have a wealth of knowledge, and your organization has helped so many companies through this. Just share a little bit. How can people get in contact with you? What kind of services do you provide? Maybe a little bit more detail. And I'll flash your email address here before we end the episode.
Yeah. So if we think specifically in the security space, right? So let's start there, and then I can maybe just do a 30-second on a broader example. We do gap assessments. So if you have an existing security policy, you want to know how you're doing against that policy, we can help you through that process. Network assessments, we do that routinely and regularly. The number of OT networks essentially that just evolved over time and weren't really designed or engineered. So we come in, assess what's there, help you understand what's there, and then more importantly, help you come up with a plan to get from where you are to something that you can build a defensible architecture with, that you can actually get more resilience out of. You can do some monitoring, network monitoring, where maybe you weren't able to do that previously with your existing architecture. Asset inventories, right? Helping people understand what's out there. A lot of times that network assessment and asset inventory kind of pairs together because people are looking to do macro or micro segmentation. I got to know who's talking to who and help you build out a strategy to support that functionality essentially in your OT environment. And so knowing what assets are there, knowing who they're talking to, why they're talking to them, is what they're doing appropriate? Sometimes you'll find dead code, things that are there essentially that just isn't really serving a purpose anymore, and yet it's still information that's on the wire. And then security control and tool implementation. You get that network assessment done, you get the network upgraded, and now we can actually go deploy a network security monitoring tool. We've got the ability to span or tap a network and get visibility into that network. We can help people through the hardening process because you apply a typical DoD STIG to an OT environment, and oftentimes you're going to break things. So there's going to be controls or STIGs that you're going to have to choose to not apply in the OT environment. And we've got a pretty good record essentially of working with a number of different OEMs, Rockwell, Siemens, others essentially in that space. And then, last but not least, we are a system integrator. So if you're looking to do anything new, greenfield, brownfield, you want to do a system upgrade, site upgrade, things of that nature. We say our solution space is essentially everything from ERP integration, meaning that we don't do actual ERP programming, but we'll do interfaces and solutions into ERP systems for the ability to pull inventory information, push work in process back up into an ERP system. So MES deployments, MOM deployments, all the way down essentially to the level 0 assets of a Purdue or a Paramodel, essentially where we're actually directly connecting to the outside world through variable frequency drives, things of that nature. We do have a panel shop and do panel construction, electrical enclosure construction work up in Nashville as well, and would be glad to help anybody in that space do that both for our own services and for others. And so if you're just looking to have a panel built, that's something another thing that we can provide. So yeah.
You can do all sorts of stuff, Larry. And to reach you, I've got your email address here popped up on the screen. So feel free to reach out to Larry for any kind of OT, cyber, gap, integration that you might need. So Larry, thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being a friend for so many years, and looking forward to having you on again sometime.
Yeah, definitely, man. Appreciate the opportunity. Glad to dig into any of these things in more detail if that's something somebody's interested in as well. Last shameless plug I'll just mention real quick. We're a member of the manufacturing ISAC. And so if you're out there in the defense industrial base and looking for some information sharing in the intelligence space, you can find us there. And I actually do a monthly discussion with that group, essentially just kind of a Q&A session. So anybody that's a member can call in and ask questions, and we'll help answer them for them. So
I love it. No shameless plug there. That's a resource that people desperately want, because I talk to a lot of manufacturers. They're like, we have no idea where to start when it comes to this stuff. So Larry, again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon, my friend.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Daniel.
Absolutely. See you, Larry.